Hello and welcome to the second in our series for Data and Collaboration brought to you by Annex. These webinars are looking at different aspects of data within the BIM environment. Today, we'll look at data security. This is clearly an area of growing importance in construction, particularly as digitalization increases from design through to asset use. We'll discuss the importance of protecting data, including the need for a common data environment, the potential pitfalls if data is not properly secured, and what to do if a breach is discovered, and the competitive advantage compliance can bring. My name is Rob Jones, partner at B2B Connect, and I'll be your host. Joining me are Paul Shillcock, Managing Director of Operam and author of ISO 19650-2 and the UK National Annex, Dr. Anas Bataw, Director for the Centre of Excellence in Smart Construction at Heriot University, Dubai. Derek Bourke, Project Digital Construction Manager at Royal BAM Group. Sultan Moraished, Chief Information Security Officer for the Red Sea Development Company and Amala. And Nabil Nougha, Technical Sales AEC, Plant and AWP at Autodesk. Sultan, at the beginning of the design process, what planning and thought needs to be in place around data security, and is it well understood why this is important?
Thank you, Rob. I believe before we put our plans and thoughts, we have to understand the criticality of the design and the designer work natures. If the process are limited to a certain number of company individuals, then the security of the critical systems measures have to be applied. And if we will involve limited third parties, then we should tailor the company third-party security requirements to address those security concerns. And if it's a generic design or a competition that's being given to a lot of third parties, then they can apply the basic third-party security assessments. From my point of view, usually the designers or the construction people are not so much keen on having the security or on having their design secure, because they simply do not understand the risk of losing them, or the risk of them being stolen or given to another party. So if you highlight those risks to them, if you onboard them into your programs, onboard them into the nature of the cybersecurity systems that you are applying in your organization, they will understand it and they will get it, and they will support you to ensure that their designs or their work is being secured. But you have to understand a very critical point. You are there to empower them. You are there to facilitate their work. You are not there to give them a lot of restrictions which will cause an impact in their work. And if you do this, they will try to deviate from whatever you are doing. So always have in your mindset that you are a business enabler, that you are you are part of their team, but include the security requirements and standards that you are applying in your organization.
So I think that's a good point, Anas, that Sultan was making there. And I guess what's the middle ground? Because what you're getting at is that you want people to do their jobs effectively without compromising security. So Anas, what kind of change management processes are required?
I think that's the biggest risk. We see that when it comes to digital transformation in general, there's drivers for digital transformation. They see the huge benefits of going digital, and sometimes the cloud and etc. And then you got people from other side of the table, as Sultan mentioned, that they look at the risks, they look at the issues to do with cybersecurity, they look at the things to do with security in general, especially when it comes to data and cyber attacks. The common ground really is for both to sit on the same table and make sure that they understand what each one needs, as Sultan mentioned, and we'll talk about this in detail, I'm assuming later on. We need to make sure that we understand why we are introducing certain softwares and certain solutions, in this case BIM. How can we introduce it in the best way possible? Not to neglect process and procedures of the way we work, and more importantly, to make sure that we meet the policies and legislations that we have in place. Not to look at them as constraints, but it's always part of the change management, as you mentioned. So it's all about getting people to be aware of what's going on and what everything means. And it's just sometimes just a matter of doing a few tasks here and there just to make sure that you tick the box, because we've seen some issues in the past where organizations have made the decision not to proceed with a certain solution, although the business processes, teams and etc. They really want to do it because it brings in revenue or efficiency and etc. There has been decisions made by the board to say no, we value our data, we think there's risk here, that therefore we need to shut it down, which they didn't have to. So to avoid these extreme approaches, I think we need to all have these common grounds to make sure that we all understand what each one of us needs, and also to make sure that we satisfy the requirements and build a knowledge base with the process and procedures and policies.
And I guess, Paul, also, if the balance is tipped the wrong way towards IT, then I mean that's a vulnerability. That's a big vulnerability, because then people are trying to find workarounds.
Yeah, there's always sort of this tension, I guess, between the sort of the project team and IT, and I think a lot of the time IT departments do probably go a little bit above and beyond in terms of, you know, where they're sort of setting the bar really, and the restrictions that they're putting in place, which they feel are necessary in order to maintain the level of security needed. But I think if they go too far, they're actually in danger of actually opening up new vulnerabilities. You know, as individuals, you know, none of us really like to be sort of constrained in terms of what we can and can't do, and particularly when there's deadlines and, you know, we just want to get on and do our own thing. And I pick up on the previous points around, you know, the need for educating individuals who may not actually understand the risks that they're introducing by doing this thing. But, you know, I think it is largely human nature and very cultural within the construction industry in particular. You know, and particularly when we see it a lot when project teams or IT teams are implementing their accommodating environments, you know, and that sort of goes against the grain in terms of what we're trying to do is have this collaborative environment where individuals, teams can collaborate, can exchange information. And quite often they find that they can't do that because of some of the IT policies that are put in place. And, you know, particularly whether that's in the office or out on site, or, you know, personal devices or work devices. And, you know, generally people will find a way around, you know, whatever it is that is put in place, you know, however sophisticated the IT team think their security policies are, people generally will find a way around it. And, you know, not only that,
copying onto a USB key, that sort of thing.
Yeah, I mean, there's, you know, that's probably the biggest frustration, where, you know, people aren't able to do what they need to do, so they will start, you know, trying to save it locally, you know, emailing that out to other people because they can't access the accommodating environment or whatever it might be. And so all of a sudden you've just lost control over all of your information. You know, it's now you know, scattered the four corners of the globe, and yet you've got this really secure sort of nucleus of information, but actually all your information is now out into the open. So yeah, it's a difficult one for IT to balance. And I think largely it's about working with the business. You know, we find IT teams will say, well, the business doesn't tell us what it needs, and the business will say, well, the IT doesn't do what we need it to do. So I think a lot more communication between those two teams is probably needed.
And I guess that also starts to introduce version control problems as well, if you have people emailing stuff out. Derek, as a contractor, how are you making sure that a client's data security policies are followed? How do you ensure that that you're enforcing those?
This happens on every project. It's not just the one solution for the whole group. So every client will have a different requirement. So the best way to ensure that you as a group are a secure digital company is by getting certified. So whether it's BIM standards, you go to the ISO for certification. Same when it's IT security standards, you'll go to the relevant certifiers. So cybersecurity, security certification, antivirus, spyware, firewalls, as well as your own group policies. So having created policies like for catastrophe recovery process. So if you lose data, that you know exactly where to go and who to contact to recover it. Also then, when you are contracted to a client, they will have specific requirements, what CDE to use, whether they specify a CD, but they may specify this to the level of security required. Therefore, as a contractor, we're obliged then to work to these security requirements. So it simply is establishing these requirements at the outset. So when you're responding to the tender requirements, therefore you have your clear certification of what standards you apply to. You answer the relevant questions. That every client will be different. You show that your CD is secure, that you're able to provide security groups, so that the information when you're issuing it is issued to the right person or groups, and these groups are the only ones that will have access to that information.
And Derek is coming from the contractor side. Sultan, you're coming, I guess, you're coming from the client side. There are a lot of companies in the value chain, and contractors, they'll be present for the period of a contract, or they're part of the contract, and then they leave. So how do you ensure that they're following your rules and thinking longer term about data security?
Actually, all the contractors, before they sign with the company, they usually sign the NDA. But to be honest with you, NDA is not enough for certain cases. So you have to have a third-party cybersecurity requirements that has to be signed between you and the client. And that cybersecurity requirements, you have to always tell your contractors that I do not want you for a period of time and then you leave. We want to build a partnership between both of the organizations. So if you violate one of the cybersecurity requirements that we are giving you, you may actually have an issue in working with us in the future. When they are onboarded into that concept, they will make sure that their work is being completed as per the schedule, and they do not have any cybersecurity flaws, because they know that their relation with you as a company is going to be impacted. And always have yourself as an auditor for them, not only on the onboarding, but you have to continuously check the controls that they are putting in place. You have also to ensure that your data, or the critical data that you are giving to those contractors, are always hosted within your environment. Nothing is passed or leaving your environment, because you never know what's going to happen with this data when it leaves your organization. And if it is sent to leave your organization to another one, make sure that you are applying the appropriate encryption controls to add a level of security to them. So the key here is the partnership. Always capitalize into that factor, because we are speaking business here, and we do not want the relation between the company and the contractor to be impacted in the future. So always build that partnership between you and them, ensure that they are onboarded, have those checks and things, and I'm sure that you will be closing 80 to 90% of the security gaps that the contractor usually leaves when he completes the project.
And actually, it's interesting, because what you're saying there is really leading towards the business benefits that maybe people don't often think about, which is that if you're complying with these, you're more likely to win more business. If you're not complying to these, then you're not. And maybe that reputation will also get out into the industry as well. So, Paul, does that kind of compliance that Sultan's been talking about, does that become more difficult? Does security start to become more complicated once you start to move down the tiers? Because there are so many different levels within a complex project in terms of contractors, subcontractors, etc. And is this where something I know you talked about in the past, which is this where you need to have your federation strategy in place?
Generally, it is. It does get more difficult the further down the tiers that you go. I think we need to be probably a little bit realistic as well in terms of, whilst I agree with Sultan about the business benefit and building those relationships, for sure, top management in organizations, particularly in tier 1, tier 2, will be across that. I'm very aware of the benefit of conforming to the requirements and strengthening that relationship. But those benefits and that sort of awareness does sort of weaken as you go further down the tiers. And the reality of it is, as well as generally, it's the lower tiers where the vast majority of the information is also produced. So it is difficult, to pass on that benefit further along. I think the other thing as well is that as you go down the tiers, and I think this is pretty consistent around the world, is that the vast majority of organizations are SMEs or small to medium-sized enterprises. They don't have necessarily the skills or the individuals dedicated to the role of IT or IT security, and the individuals within there, again, they're not sort of culturally that they may not be used to be working at that sort of level. So there are things that you can do in terms from an IT perspective, controlling the information. It's interesting for Sultan to say about when that information leaves the organization. I think in the vast majority of projects that we've worked on, very few, if I'm struggling to think of any project where all of the information has been stored within a accommodating environment without the ability for information to be distributed out of it. So we have to accept that fact that information will also leave. And so I think, just picking up on the point around the federation strategy, it's something that's it's probably not very well understood generally. It's been a part of the information management process, or a key part of it in the early planning stages. But it's about dividing up the information. There's a number of reasons that I won't go into too much around why you develop a federation strategy. But one of the benefits is around security, in order that you are able to parcel up pieces of information that you can then give access to the suppliers. So they don't have access to everything. They only have access to the information that they need to do the bit that they need. And that is actually easier said than done, because a lot of planning and thought needs to go into that, particularly when you get onto large sort of mega projects where you've got quite a vast supply chain. So it's important to understand that. So I guess the strategy really is probably more around controlling who has access to what, and maybe just accepting some levels of risks. That in terms of the lower tiers, in terms of the information that they're producing as well, it's about how they then pass that back up into this centralized repository, for want of a better word.
That must bring in also actually a risk for the contractor as well as the client, if the contractor is the person that's engaged the subcontractor, I guess. Yeah,
absolutely. And I think this is particularly important when you're during the tendering stage. When the client goes out for tender, working with the large contractors, that the sharing of information pre-contract, you have to go out with that information. If you're building a nuclear power plant or whatever it might be, you have to go out with that information so the tenderers can actually tender against it. It's a bit easier to control that, but contractor then has to go out and procure their supply chain as well. So they have to provide that information to their supply chain so they can bid for that work as well. And so there are mechanisms in place. So there's a thing called an information sharing agreement, which sounds a little bit like what Sultan was saying about that NDA stroke cybersecurity policy. But yeah, it's signing up to the commitment about what that information can be used for, what they can then what they can and can't do with that information, and maybe about upon termination, should they be successful or should they be unsuccessful, about what happens to that information. So yeah, it can get a little bit difficult as you go down, but certainly introduces some risk to the contractors, which I think more and more we're starting to see contractors a little bit savvy up a little bit more around that as well.
So I'll move on slightly, and then I think I know that I've got some questions for Derek in a bit, and I think it would be good to point to that as well, actually, Derek, when we're talking. But first of all, Anas and Nabil. So Anas first, and then Nabil. I'm going to ask you, what type of considerations need to be in place as organizations move from what has been a traditional, in the past, 2D process to what is now a 3D process, and they're moving towards having a common data environment, especially actually as you start to get those increasing levels of complexity?
First of all, I think organizations need to be aware that they are moving away from 2D to 3D. There's a lot of organizations that tend to do both, and still have the same policies and procedures for the traditional way of working, while satisfying certain requirements on a project to do the BIM processes or digital processes or the 3D models and etc. First thing first, as I said, is to update the policies and procedures, make sure that they have the right technology and platforms in place. And I'll mention it again. It's all about knowledge transfer as well, not only within the organizations but everyone around. As Sultan mentioned, from a developer perspective, they obviously push in the supply chain, whether it's consultants or contractors. As Paul mentioned, the contractors should work with their subcontractors, and then the consultants should work with the subconsultants, and even suppliers and manufacturers and etc. So it is a matter of making sure that everyone is aware that we are moving away from 2D to the 3D environment or the digital environments, and therefore, incorporate within their processes, procedures, and policies, and etc. And more importantly, within their contracts and agreements, because we still see this happening. So even if there is a BIM requirement on a project or a GIS requirement, whatever it is in terms of digital platforms, we'll still see the contracts not even updated according to that as well. So there's a lot of things that need to be updated. And I know we're going to be touching on intellectual property in a bit, but one of the things, the intellectual property, cybersecurity, how can you save the data, how often, CDE requirements, federation strategy, as Paul mentioned, and etc. So the list goes on, and this all needs to be reflected in embedded in not only the tendering documents, but also contracts and agreements, and policies and procedures.
Okay. And Nabil, from your point of view?
I think what's important is also to identify and support who is able to perform that move, whatever name we will apply here. If it's a sponsor, or a champion, or a digital transformation product owner, or anything else. But we need to leverage them because they will become the trainers later on that transition, which should include, by the way, those security aspects in the trainings as well. Another important thing is that this move needs to happen from the top management, as Sultan mentioned before, and this without disturbing ongoing projects. So that means a plan needs to be drafted with clear KPIs, milestones, stakeholders, call to action, with the technology evolution and adoption as a target. And this plan needs to be executed by the entire company. And this is something very important here as well, because that move from 2D to 3D to BIM to advanced level of BIM is in reality, it's beneficial for the entire organization. For example, a good practice to orient people and the whole group into that transformation could be to cleverly involve HR in a way that they might have to update all the job description for the future hiring processes and include some digital buzzwords like innovative tools, processes, advanced workflow to attract and retain talent, and also to align the actual and legacy staff with this transition process. And yeah, definitively that move needs to include everyone, from the top management to individual contributors, whatever department they belongs to, so that synergies produced by a common data environment around BIM will become an advantage on the operation, but also be an attractive facade for the entire group against the competition.
So Derek, now both Anas and Paul talked about documentation at the tendering stage, the fact that for a contractor, you're not just thinking about what you're trying to bid for and win, but also any subcontractor level as well. This is all getting quite complex for you, and then you're trying to manage your BIM team and your BIM processes. So I get how are you adjusting your approaches to tie all of this together?
I suppose for the audience that are listening that may want to learn more about what the main contractors do or what the requirements are, but it's just to go back to whether it's a BIM job or it's not a BIM job, that doesn't prevent anyone using the BIM processes. So the use of a CDE. So as a group, the guys mentioned going to top management to set the standards. As a group, we categorize our projects in terms of size of their value. So we would have a category A, B, and C. Now A and B have to use the BIM processes. C then have a choice, but all those three grades, A, B, and C, still have to use a CDE. I don't know any project manager I've worked under in the last 3-4 years that would not request a CDE, whether it's a light CDE or a complicated CDE. Whatever project is on, project managers want a common data environment so that they can track the documents, the information that's going in and going out. So as the main contractor, this is now our way of working. And then to answer your question, as it becomes more complicated, then the sophistication of the CDE gets more complicated. So whether we're using a light common data environment for a category C job or a more complex one for a category A job, the coordination and the collaboration then is on the BIM job. You have to know what's going out and who it's going to. So when you're asking about the security for maybe issuing a cost schedule, again, that goes back to grouping in the CDE and who can see this information and being able to track when they received it and vice versa when you receive their information. Just to finish off, again, I think I touched on it last when I spoke. This all needs to be established early at the tender stage, so roles and responsibilities can be determined and prepared to roll out then across the project.
Just as a slight aside to that, Derek, is this also the stage where you're talking to the client about what digital technologies you're planning to use?
Again, some clients may not require any new technology. They may be a traditional group that are just want the job built within program and within budget. But therefore, that's why we will apply these new technologies. We can present them how we're producing the job. We may even produce an EIR for them so that we can shove it out to the rest of the supply chain. We will also then maybe implement a BIM execution plan. If there's no 3D models, we then as a main contractor will probably produce 3D models ourselves and go to our supply chain to produce 3D models, because we will see the benefit from it and present the client along the way, show them the benefits, hoping that maybe their next job will change. But again, it doesn't matter really. We can show them the benefit, how they'll benefit from it. But at the end of the day, we're the ones that are solely benefiting from coordination, collaboration, and security.
And Nas, we're now starting increasingly to think about facilities management and all the way through to using things such as digital twins. So what, again, I suppose a similar sort of question, which is, what does this mean for the construction processes and security?
When it comes to upgrading from BIM to integrate into other solutions, all the way to digital twin and integrating that with IoT and etc. That's when the big risks really happen, because we're moving away from static data, which is what you create during the project within the BIM model. Although it is important data, and it is data that is required to be secured. However, when you move on to live data and start capturing information and moving on to the digital twin and facility management, and possibly integrating that with some of the smart city or smart building systems that you may need to introduce to, or even integrating that data with the CAFM systems, that's when the real issues happen when it comes to threats and security breaches. Because yes, with BIM data, yes, people can access information about the building and know the blueprints of the building and know certain things with data and etc. But when you're talking about digital twin or smart systems within the building, or even sensors within the building, that's the real threat, where people can actually take control of your building. People can access certain things, access your CCTV cameras or whatever, and then that's a real threat, and that's where a lot of focus is happening. With that said, there is actually a lot of investment that's happening within that aspect, and I feel, and maybe Paul can maybe comment on that. There's a very minimal investment commercially when it comes to cybersecurity. When it comes to, I know there's a lot of ISO standards, there's a lot of requirements, there's the BS standards that did come out previously to capture these aspects, but there's very minimal investment when it comes to the BIM requirements, and maybe because people are not seeing it as threatening, but it is still threatening, as I mentioned, not as threatening as a digital twin, but it is still threatening, and it still will have some issues and risks associated with that.
Nabil, you must be talking to clients all the time about how they're thinking about things like advanced uses of BIM, and also, I guess, all the way through to digital twin. How are you marrying that and then advising them on what they need to consider to make sure that, particularly if it's critical infrastructure, to make sure that they know how to manage that data properly?
Generally speaking, what we see, so actually a construction company willing to extend its capability to facility management using innovative way like IoT, digital twin, VR, AR, and others to assess and maintain a physical twin will always be an advantage as opposed to other companies without experience in construction. And this, especially if construction processes were already in place using BIM models to store and articulate the required data to feed construction phases downstream. And we tend to see this extended scope for construction because of the recurring demand on the market to control the operation of facility in real time. And this brings potential new businesses for construction companies and stakeholders, new challenges, as Anas mentioned, in terms of security. So it's also relevant to extend these FM capabilities to construction for safety, risk, and insurance companies who use more and more delivered dashboard to quickly get information on an incident or potential accident, and having construction early in the loop of the project delivery to the operation is definitively an advantage and add cohesion to the life cycle of a project.
So Sultan, moving to cybersecurity, and actually it's very interesting, Nabil just talked about insurance, because I know this is something insurance companies are very keen on in terms of making sure that the right policies and practices are in place and also the right procedures taken. But how are you trying to make sure that everybody understands and make sure that protection is in place, and what sort of vulnerabilities could come your way?
So I'm gonna split this question into two, because if you want to ensure that there is a protection in place, you have to apply and follow the best global cybersecurity standards. Doesn't matter how many years of experience you have in cybersecurity. Doesn't matter how many projects you work in cybersecurity. You have always to align your program with a common standard, a regulatory requirement, if they are in place. So once you do that, you will give an authenticity of the controls that you are applying to your organization, having consideration the business nature and the way that you apply them. When we go to the other side, which is the people to understand the potential vulnerabilities. To be honest with you, they always say awareness is the way to resolve this issue. I do acknowledge that, but you have to get a little bit advanced in the awareness side. You should not always make them aware about the issues and threats that are attacking the organization only. You should get to their personal lives. You should also feed them with the threats and vulnerabilities that may harm them individually, that may harm their families, that may harm their friends. Let them understand that the cybersecurity is not something to be controlled or acknowledged within the workspace. Cybersecurity can happen with you in your personal life. And of course, if it impacted you in your personal life, there is a huge chance that's going to impact your organization, given that you are actually dealing with the organization information within your personal space. So when you get to that, when you enhance your awareness technique, when you enhance the way that you communicate them, make it a little bit personalized, be a safeguard for them. Let them come to you when there is an issue, then they will understand, and then they will indirectly adapt all your requirements, given that you are there to help them and support.
And I guess for Derek, I guess you're working with clients in lots of different countries, not just one country. So therefore, for you, you're trying to understand requirements that are not just that comply to all sorts of different rules. Do you have to make sure that you have the people in place, or a central person in place that's guiding and advising here?
Yeah, again, it comes to the projects themselves. So from a complex data center to maybe a prison, you have to control what you're sending and who you're sending at when you're at tender stage. Obviously, when you're tied into the contract, you will have NDAs and all that to govern the information that you send. But at tender stage, you might be going out to 2 or 3 electrical subcontractors to price the security system. So I suppose you have to be careful what you send. For a prison, maybe it's schematic is enough for them to price the job. You don't send them the floor plans. Of course, that needs expertise to know that, yes, they will be able to price from the schematics, or no, they do need the floor plans so that they can measure the length of their runs, their cable trays and stuff like that. So it would be sending the floor plans. You don't have to send them the complete model. You don't have to send them the native files in maybe Revit, DWG, or whatever they were produced in. You could send them an IFC or a PDF. So that does bring into the case of an experienced person over certain jobs. So data centers would bring their own confidentiality agreements and that. But then again, moving away from looking after the client, as a main contractor, you'll also have to look after yourself. You need to protect the information for your own company. So that would be a lot of training. Involve training in your team, your tender team, where they're storing their information. Simple thing is not storing information on your C drive. It should be on a shared cloud environment so that anybody can access it when they need to. It should be archived when you want to look back on it halfway through the job. What did we do there and then? So protecting is for your client, but is also for your company as well.
Okay, so
and training is the best way.
Cool. In terms of what Derek was talking about there, slicing data up, particularly if it's critical infrastructure, is that the security-minded approach?
It is, and I think so. This whole thing around security-minded approach, we haven't got a lot of time, but thankfully this is all well documented in ISO 19650 part 5, which I would encourage anybody listening to take a look at. Part 5 in particular, and this idea of a security-minded approach. The problem is, I think a lot of people think it's an IT thing or an IT issue, something for IT department to sort out. It's more aimed towards the asset owner themselves, because as Derek said, only they understand the assets themselves. So within the standard, it starts off with a triage process, and that's really about the asset owner taking a view of their assets, taking a view of the risks and the vulnerabilities to it, and identifying which of those assets are deemed to be sensitive. Okay, so Derek highlighted the sort of security system within a prison, for example. That particular asset would be higher, more sensitive than the hard landscaping, for example. So once you understand what those sensitive assets are, it's about then looking at the information relating to them. And so there's a number of processes within it, and that's largely based around coming up with an information security strategy as a holistic strategy, and then an individual plan around the sort of the production, the use and the management of that information. And that would lead on to what Anas was talking there about, digital twins and so on, where it obviously becomes a little bit more thought needs to go into that. And then from that, this concept of adopting a security-minded approach cannot be at the top management. It's then, once that planning's been done, is then communicating that effectively to everybody involved in either the production, the use, or the management of that information. So it's a security-minded approach is a little bit more holistic. It can be supported by the IT, but it's very much around the people and the process perspective for information security.
And we're starting to see more smart buildings, smart cities, again, alluded to here with, I guess, what people are saying in terms of as you start to get that monitoring. So how are you advising people to start thinking about security once you start to have these technologies being integrated, like IoT, AI, etc.? Because you're going to end up with potentially personalized data.
There's no need to reinvent the wheel. There's a lot of policies out there. There's a lot of national policies when it comes to data and cybersecurity. However, we do need to take what it says in these guidelines, or maybe strategies from a national perspective, and implement it within an organization perspective. But I think the best way to approach it, this is what we've been doing, is basically tackle every single system separately. Make sure that there's a lot of people that say, okay, I'm going to be doing BIM, GIS, blockchain, AI, right? Let's do a policy for all as one bundle. I think that's when you really start missing things, and it gets really complicated. The way it should be done is treat every single system separately, and in some cases, even with BIM, treat the CDE policy separately than other things within the BIM softwares, just to make sure that you've got the right processes and procedures and systems in place, and even individuals and teams working on them will be different. Therefore, it has to be a different setup from one to another, and do the same when it comes to AI, IoT, and etc. And the same thing with when people talk about smart cities or smart cities in general. There's a lot of moving parts in that, and then to try and approach it as one thing and say, okay, I'm gonna protect it all as once with one shield per se, or one strategy. You're aiming for failure, and you're really complicating everything. The best way to do it is to make sure that the whole idea of cybersecurity and management of data should be something that everyone is aware of, as Sultan mentioned. Be very personal, and make sure everyone's aware of it, because we are living in a digital era. Everyone is moving towards that. So whether you are using digital technology in your workplace, or even at home, or within your social life, you need to be very aware of what impacts this data has, and just how you would use Facebook and WhatsApp in a different ways, although they are integrated now. Same again with different softwares. You need to, and different solutions in your workplace, you need to treat them differently. You need to need to make sure that you tackle them in a different way and be aware of what each one of them may have in terms of implications, and make sure you have the right processes and procedures in place to make sure you manage these risks.
One area we haven't really talked about, Paul, is that of data aggregation. Explain what that is, and also how companies and individuals should be thinking to make sure that they don't fall foul of that.
I think Anas just touched on it a little bit there in terms of, you know, the data exists in different places, and you know, I think when you're looking at the vulnerabilities and the sensitive assets, you know, it can just be an individual, a part of an asset or the entire asset, and so if we're talking about a sort of a hostile threat to life, you know, be it, you know, taking over a public transport system or somewhere where there's a mass gathering, you know, data and information that may seem quite innocent and, you know, people are fairly lax about or sharing because it doesn't tell the whole story. What these hostile elements are able to do is they aggregate data from the multiple sources to then gain the information that they need in order to, you know, to undertake whatever attack they're deeming to be or they're planning to do. And so, you know, it's only what you do again in your own personal life. Do you know what I mean? Obviously, people know my name, they know my email address, which is fine. But then if they then sort of knew my home address and my date of birth and my mum's surname, you can start to build up quite a lot of data about me, and then potentially use that for other, you know, for other purposes. And so when we think about information about assets, you know, it's about that the data that we share may seem innocent, but we need to be mindful of if that was aggregated with others, and just to, you know, the way in which, particularly on sort of the critical national infrastructure, you know, we've got iPhones now with LiDAR scanners on. You know, people are quite able to go around quite covertly to capture a lot of data, be it about CCTV or whatever it might be. You know, and it's all about mining and aggregating that data. So again, this ties into the security-minded approach that people just need to be mindful of that.
So, Sultan, I think let's move on to what happens when you discover a breach, and that, you know, we know it's don't cover it up, but so what processes should people be taking? You know, what process should companies follow if they discover a breach?
You should always escalate it. Escalate it to your line manager, escalate it to the concerned department. Don't you ever hide it. That's what you said, and I strongly acknowledge that. However, in order for you to build that behavior in your employees, you have to give them, not only employees and even third parties, you have to give them the confidence that you are there to help them. You are not there to expose them if there is any breach or a problem. They have to understand that if they hide it, the consequences might be higher than if you share it. They have to understand that the cybersecurity or the information security department or your line manager is always a secure person to go to and expose that threat. And here I'm not talking about cybersecurity, I'm talking about everything, but especially with cybersecurity, you have to immediately do that, because once you do this, the concerned department will be able to address the problem, evaluate the whole situation, and immediately resolve it, because simply most of the cybersecurity breaches can be resolved if they were reported in early stages. And of course, once you report this, the team and the department will be able to put the mitigation controls around it. If you are intending to build that relationship between you and the employees, you have to show some personalized communications between both of you. You have to approach them. Usually the cybersecurity or the information security team are always classified as the police of the organization. This has to change in order for you to address the concern when it happens and the threats when it arises, and evaluate the situation and close it. And one final tip into this: do not be only the person to go to for office-related issues. be also the person to go to when there is a personal related breaches or vulnerabilities, because that's how you build your relation between you and the individuals of the organization.
And Derek, I guess also learn from the breach.
Group protocols for IT would need to be established and introduced. So that's security alerts, training, awareness, no workarounds, no unsecure file sharing. The security alerts would be keep people informed. Do you know who the sender of the email is? Am I expecting the email? Do I normally receive links like this? These are the standards check you do when you receive an email with a link. And if any of the answers to that is no, well, delete the email and inform IT. Then let them deal with it. They'll research the source of the email, and then we'll send out a group-wide alert. Then on the other side, then when you come down to project level, project kickoff meetings need to happen for everybody. So whether you're halfway through the job and you have a new QA QC inspector, a new engineer, a new construction manager, they need to be introduced to the project, and they need to be introduced to the ways of working. So that from the start establishes the ways of the practice. So keep people informed, share lessons learned, and have project kickoffs.
We do hear about where data is lost on in a taxi or on public transport. USB keys are lost. What's the process? Should you be thinking about there, where somebody's just accidentally lost, what could be key information, but at the same time may never come to light?
Yeah, it is a tricky one, and I think a lot of it comes down to, as most things, comes down to human nature. No one really likes to admit the fact that they've lost something, or potentially, or and without understanding those consequences. So I'm completely with Sultan in terms of having that. I think it's known as a whistleblowing policy as much as anything, where you're able to admit something without any fear of recourse or whatever it might be. But just having that trust. But yeah, I think, as I say, there's in my experience as well, there's a lot of those incidents. Even going back to, I think the Part 5 of ISO 19650 started as a UK standard, and that originated was when the whole sort of BIM movement kicked off. There was a lot of presentations, and the Ministry of Justice had just done the Exemplar project, where they had this nice shiny 3D model of their new youth offenders prison, which they then generously presented to a room full of people at a conference, and look how we can zoom into this detail, and we've got all this data and so on. And there was somebody in the audience having heart failure because all this information is now coming out in the public domain. So yeah, it's it is about the culture and the human nature, but being able to hold your hands up and without fear of recourse, both individually, and I know we might not have time, but I'd be interested in Sultan's view about, as an organisation, and maybe Derek's, would they then pass that on to the clients to say, well, actually, we've had a breach, we've sorted it, don't worry, but we just thought you'd want to know. I'd be interested. I know there's mechanisms generally in commercial agreements that they're obliged to do that. But I'm very skeptical about whether actually organisations do genuinely hold their hands up when they've dropped the ball.
I think, Anas, before we move to questions, and we're getting questions, so I will move to them in a moment. I think this question, to be honest, we could probably run a whole webinar on this question, but let's have a go anyway. You highlighted earlier intellectual property, and I guess what you're getting to there is, who owns the data? Yeah,
when you talk about cybersecurity, is first of all, there's internal threats or breaches, and there's external breaches. How do you go ahead with the internal if you don't know who owns the intellectual property when it comes to BIM? It's one of them topics, and I'm sure a lot of us have had these conversations in many cases, especially at the beginning of the whole BIM revolution in the early 2000s, maybe 2009, 2010. in the UK when we're talking about the BIM levels, BIM level 2 and BIM level 3, and everyone was concerned about once we start moving in from BIM level 2, which is your separate, everyone's working on a separate model, to BIM level 3, where everyone's working on a collaborative model within one CDE, and how's that going to look like, and who's going to own the data, and etc. I think the ultimate answer that everyone would really say is the property should be owned by whoever pays for it, which is in many cases the client. But a lot of clients are not aware of the data, and yes, they are paying for the project itself, which is the building and the assets, but they're not really specifying the data that's being built within the project. And that goes back to the comment that I mentioned earlier about making sure your contracts and agreements and etc. it does reflect that, because some clients even request for BIM models to be used, and some of them are not aware there's a lot of data that's been consumed, a lot of data that's been produced for the project, and a lot of them, even the educated ones, they only ask for the asset information model, and they're not really concerned with the project information model, which usually in many cases has a lot more data than you'll see in the asset information model. So I think the ultimate answer to that is yes, we could go for days and days and talk about this, and people would have different opinions and different experiences. I personally had different experiences on different projects about IP itself. The ultimate answer to this is I'm a big believer that whoever pays for it, which is ultimately the client. But in that case, I would suggest that clients should be aware of this issue and make sure that they obtain the right licenses and assignments of the right people within their organizations, to make sure that they capture this IP issue.
Especially is because I understand where you're coming from in terms of, the client, because they're the one that's paying for it. But actually, if a company, if a supplier or a vendor has spent a lot of time and investment and money developing a system that can be used, maybe it's even a contractor that has actually had a system developed for them, they're going to argue, well, actually, we want to flow this across different contracts. And that's going to make it a lot more difficult then.
Absolutely. You can argue and say there's the same thing even before BIM, before the whole thing, what happened when people used to design, unique systems or equipment or even buildings. Can they reuse it? It's all can be done, but it's a matter of just making sure you capture this issue and make sure your agreements can make sure that it does reflect what the project has. As I said, I've personally been involved in projects where in some cases an architect was obtained the intellectual property, in some cases the client, and in other cases even the contractor. But again, you can even argue and say, what about the information that comes from the manufacturers and the supply chain and the suppliers? Does that go all the way to the owner? It should be, because it is within the assets. But again, it's definitely one of them topics that would require another session to talk about, and maybe. But I guess it should be addressed within the cybersecurity issue, because when you talk about cybersecurity, you talk about internal and external threats, but also confidentialities. Certain things could be part of your confidentiality requirements or agreements. So therefore, if I share it within my group of companies or team, or even if I share it with another client, I'm allowed to, because it's part of my confidentiality, it's part of my IP. So there is, again, you might have heard of cybersecurity or security issues that have happened, and it didn't go anywhere because the other party was actually sharing the information that they were owning the property for, the intellectual property, so they were allowed to share it. So yeah, it's definitely something that should be addressed separately, but it should be reflected within your cybersecurity strategy as an organization or as a project.
Rob, just to finish off on that, I agree, it is a complex topic. However, I just want to point out, in terms of the ISO 19650, there is a mechanism around the information protocol, which is the mechanism by which parties can agree the licensing arrangements for intellectual property. And there are some example templates out there for an information protocol, but that I completely agree that the IP question has not changed with the advent of digital information, in terms of that IP. But the ownership and what that information can be used for during the project, after the project, there's mechanisms within the protocol for licensing, which can be for free, or you can actually charge a fee if you're a supplier and there's value in that IP, and the client wants to reuse it many times, then you can license it. But all those mechanisms are within the information protocol. That's all I wanted to mention.
Okay, and thank you, because obviously this is something that people do need to know and want to know, where they can go and find that additional information as well. And you know what, this is not the first time I've done other webinars where at some point it's straight into, but who owns the data? There's clearly an issue to be discussed. Looking at questions from the audience. So the first one, possibly Sultan, but it's probably a fairly open question for everybody. How do cybersecurity teams ensure that people still comply with restrictions in cases where there is a security or legal implication for non-compliance?
When you speak about the non-compliance, actually, or the legal implications of non-compliance, then you are going to get to a different route, which is actually you found them non-compliance to your requirements, and you have updated them, and you went the extra mile to issue a legal case against them. But what I believe that either either you are going to them legally or not, you have to always ensure that all the controls are being followed without considering the legal implications on place. That's from my point of view, because if you are going to get to that path, believe me, you will not ending up raising a lot of legal cases for non-compliant individuals. And also you have to build the relationship between you and the clients in order for you to succeed, getting the ultimate goal of both of you as a contractor and a company or a client.
Next question is, what are the challenges with data segregation when some partners are allowed access due to location, for example, and others aren't, particularly in areas such as 4D, 5D? Nabil, is that something you can, you're with your background in Autodesk, is that something you can talk about?
When I read that question, I directly ping me some current workflow that we are working on. Basically, it's more an oil and gas workflow. It's the AWP, advanced work packaging. I'm heavily involved with, and that workflow basically resolve that issue, because you will connect people on site cleverly, whatever location they are, whatever department they belongs to coordinate in a smooth way important tasks they need to do in a specific period of time. And this includes some platform deployment on devices, tablets, mobile, on explosive atmospheres area, for example. And there is a huge demand on that at the moment. So when now the data segregation is resolved by fact with this process, but when we think about the security part as a challenge, because there could be a breach that might happen, and some data could leak somehow. So that's why the protocol of the data exchange needs to be reviewed heavily from the IT perspective. And a bit like Sultan just mentioned previously, we should not reach the legal phase. We should, because the security awareness is a long journey for everybody in the company, and this is about trainings. It's about habits. It's about some dedicated mechanism like a single sign-on that we also provide, by the way, to facilitate the connection to different systems. Also, as I said, habits. When you connect, you disconnect. Make sure that your device is with you and keep it. And also trainings. We should have regular trainings, and we tend to see more companies who basically assess their staff in a very clever way. They send like fake spam, for example, and they measure the way people react, and then they give a rate. People have their their rate every month with a dashboard saying you are doing well because you are blocking that attack, and also you are reporting it. So this is part of the training, advanced training for security, which could be applied to any companies.
If you have data segregation where some can and some can't, I mean, you could argue that it could be a case of that the can'ts just simply don't need to know that information. But I mean, the question here is alluding to due to location. So are we talking here also about things like if you can collaborate across different countries and that sort of thing, where maybe there are different data security laws in place?
Geographically, there are different rules which are applied for the data. As Sultan mentioned before, there is the GDPR. We were talking together before the meeting started. The GDPR in Europe, for example, on other protocol in other location, and it's a challenge when you have to collaborate globally using all these things. But for the segregation of the data part, we need to make sure that everybody has the access to what they need to in a secure way, and this is something that needs to be administered somehow upstream. So yeah, that's important if we want to have a smooth productivity between the team.
What happens when the cloud environment isn't certified by a local cybersecurity authority? And I guess what we're alluding to here is things like data sovereignty, or the questioner is alluding to data sovereignty.
If you do have a cloud environment that is not certified with the cybersecurity authority, nothing will happen. That's your own cloud environment. But if you are a service provider whom are actually providing services to clients, then this is mandatory before you do that. That's the first question. Second question about data sovereignty. And in countries, in highly regulated countries, data sovereignty is one of the main concerns that each country cares about, because we have a lot of examples. If you are hosting your data not within the jurisdiction of your country, it may be accessed. Whatever controls that you put in on them, whatever encryption that you put in them, they will be accessed if there are some certain regulations or some certain requests. So I'm not going to speak on the situation of Saudi Arabia, but I know a lot of highly regulated entities, they are enforcing the service providers to build their clouds within, or build their data centers within those countries to serve their or the clients, the country clients. So from a commercial perspective, it's always beneficial for the service provider to have a presence into that country to ensure the data within those jurisdictions approved by the regulator, which will increase and boost the commercial side of that organization dealing with the country members. And from a sovereignty perspective, you are being in compliance with whatever is being mandated to you. And that's, I believe, the key that we are talking about. So in Saudi Arabia, we do have a Google Cloud partnering with Aramco to open, Alibaba, Oracle, SAP, and a lot of other service providers are on the process to build their clouds and data centers in Saudi Arabia to serve the clients of Saudi.
Thank you.
Rob, if I may add into this, it's a very it's a topic of in the Middle East. You'll hear a lot more than you would anywhere else. That goes back into the finding the common grounds that I mentioned earlier. Although what Sultan has mentioned, it makes a lot of sense, but to some of my colleagues on projects, it doesn't, and they would think, no, we need to have cloud-based solutions, because the non-cloud solutions are very limited, and ultimately there's a lot of, and Nabil calling in from Autodesk. You know, the Autodesk has really good solutions, the likes of, if I may name some of them, BIM 360 as an example. It wouldn't work otherwise if it's not cloud-based, and there's a lot of teams that are heavily relying on it. And the example that I mentioned earlier about, you know, organizations or leaders or seniors within the organization or the IT department shut down a system, I was referring to that system because they didn't understand it. They thought, oh, cloud, no, that's it. Do they have a server in our country? No, that's it. We're not doing that. So there is definitely a common ground that needs to be achieved. We need to really. I think this conversation is really healthy. I think needs to be had more often, where, you know, the cybersecurity issues need to be addressed. They need to be make sure that they clarified as well, to the operation team, to the delivery team, and the delivery team should also clarify why they need to use certain solutions and how this will impact the business and impact the operation and the projects.
And I mean, we are also seeing all the major companies, Google, Microsoft, as well. Also, sorry, and Amazon. My brain's been frozen. Yeah, so Google, Microsoft, and Amazon, they're all setting up over in this region. All of them have plans in different GCC countries. Bahrain already has. I think that's with Amazon. As Sultan said, Google have signed with Aramco in December to set up a data center. They're also planning in Qatar, and Microsoft is over here in the UAE. So I guess this kind of regional cloud it's going to happen, and cloud at customer. I think that's going to happen for some major clients as well.
And I don't think it's personally, I don't think it's a technical issue now. I think it's more very much a political one. I think. Just as to give you an example over in the UK, so when it came to data sovereignty in general, there were some exceptions, but in general, if the data center was in a country that came under EU data laws, then the UK government were generally okay with that. It was only if it was outside that. But now, as you may be aware, we've now left the European Union after Brexit, so we've now got this dilemma that a lot of the UK government data is actually in data centres in countries within the EU. So I think primarily Ireland, and so now I suspect there's a bit of a flurry now in terms of being able to have that capability within the UK. So it comes under the UK's data laws. But I think it's very much a political thing, and the trust between those nations, and you know, we can see it with certain nations around the world in terms of, you know, again in the UK we've got the whole 5G issue, where we've got a lot of investment from companies outside of the UK, and you know, do we want them countries outside the UK to have a lot of the data about our critical infrastructure? You know, so very much a political thing for me.
So final two questions, because we are overrunning a little bit, but first one, and I'm not going to claim I understand this completely. It's a little technical for me, so hopefully there's somebody who can answer it. There's been no mention of ITIL, but I guess that's IT Infrastructure Library, Type 5. Type 5 root cause analysis and no such thing as human error. Are these applicable?
Well, if I know anything about the 5 whys, it's a methodology whereby you ask the question 5 times in order to find out the actual root cause of the problem. And so, but yeah, I don't necessarily understand the concept. I think what they're trying to say, if I look at the question, is no such thing as human error. That, yeah, potentially, although we're sort of, it's either we're pointing the finger at the humans when we shouldn't be, or we should be. I don't quite necessarily understand the question, but yeah, I think you know, as part of that assessment, that triage process, you know, again, you know, a lot of that is around the continuity planning, incident management, and so on. So yeah, it's a useful methodology really in order to start to identify the root causes of some of those key risks that you might need to manage.
Okay, so I think the questioner is saying it's about what you do after a breach. How do you make sure an accidental loss doesn't affect you? Final question. Do BIM security systems have different levels? So I guess what they're saying is, are there different levels of security within BIM? And if so, how can we apply this to different levels of detail?
I would say yes, but not. It's not affected by the LOD. It's affected by things like the level of implementation, such as the ones we see in the UK, level 2 and level 3. I don't see there will be a change from the level of security just because you moved up from an LOD 200 to 300 to 400. But maybe there is, but it is maybe within the workflows you apply more things. I would say yes to the first part of the question, but it's not related to LOD. It's related to other things within the project, whether the duration of the project, the maturity, the maybe moving away from 3D to 4D to 5D, that kind of thing, or moving away from level 2 to level 3. Not in terms of LOD, but I could be wrong.
Okay.
Yeah, levels. There's always a discussion around the levels, but again, I'm going to have to read between the lines in terms of. So there's no, as far as I'm aware, security levels. There is obviously at a government level, so which is generally always been the case in terms of restricted, sensitive, and secret, and so on. From a BIM perspective. In terms of Part 5 of ISO 19650, the output of the triage process are some levels, ranging from, but that's based around the level of risk or the level of acceptable risk, and different levels will tell you what measures, potentially additional measures, would need to be put in place. So if the risk is high, then you may need to come into a closed, a local area network as opposed to a cloud if it is very sensitive. So there's some levels in that in terms of the output of the triage process. I'm not entirely sure how that relates to the level of information need. There is a new standard, a European standard, not yet an international standard, but a European standard around the level of information need to supplement ISO 19650. That is based around the different actors and the different, what they call objects or assets, for want of a better word. So if you can combine the two, if you identify as part of your triage process that there are in part or in whole assets that are deemed to be sensitive, and therefore the information relating to it needs to be managed in a different way, then the level of that level of information need, you might want to package up or consider that based on the level output from your triage process, if that makes any sense. I might have completely misunderstood the question, but that's about as good an answer I can give.
All right, thank you very much. So I think we'll wrap there because we have run over time, but I let it run because we were getting some interesting questions and some interesting answers coming through from everybody. So thank you, audience, for joining us, and thank you, speakers and panelists, for your time and input. I hope both webinars, for those of you who have seen both, have been informative. They've discussed the challenges and the opportunities that companies will face as they digitalize. Today's webinar discussed issues that are going to increasingly come to the fore in future, I think, and I've no doubt this is a subject we'll continue to cover in ever more depth, and actually probably will drill down into individual parts, like we said before, who owns the data. I think there's probably a whole webinar in just that. Both data and collaboration webinars will be made available online early next week on Digital Construction Hub, our website, which is dchub.me. So if you want to see yesterday's, if you missed it, it will be there early next week. And with that, thank you very much and goodbye.